lesson number 55 and third lesson on the login and registration forms. We are learning JavaScript and we are learning JavaScript by examples. So this is what we have done so far. In the last lesson, we learned a few CSS tricks. In this lesson, we learned how to add a bit of animation. This is what we are going to learn. When I click into any of the input fields, you'll see that there is a bit of animation, and when we click out, the wording goes back to its original size. So I will change the size of my browser one more time. This is the HTML document that I created last time, and this is the exact copy of this one. I will close this and I will double click onto it, and I'll close this one as well. So I will right mouse click and open it with my text editor, and you can use any text editor that you want. So this is the code that we have written so far. The first thing that I want to do is to fix the font size of the input field. So what happens when I type into this input field? The font size is way too small as compared to the size of the span element. But at the same time, I do not want to change the size of the placeholder. Fixing the font size is very easy. You can, in the input area of the CSS, you can say font size 18 pixels, for example. When I save it and refresh it, it changes the font size when I type into it, but it also changes the size of the placeholder, and we do not want that. Placeholder is a pseudo element, and you can target this pseudo element with the help of double colon, and you can say place holder and then opening curly bracket and a closing curly bracket, and you can say font size 12 pixel, which is the same size it was before. So if I save it now and refresh it, the placeholder is small, but when I type into it, I have a bigger font size, which is 18 pixels. This should ideally be in put double colon placeholder, and then whatever you want to do with this placeholder. To achieve what I want to achieve, I will have to make another change to this placeholder. If you notice, when I click into this input field, the placeholder is still visible. When I start typing into the field, it disappears. I need to make sure that the placeholder disappears as soon as the input field is clicked, and to do that, I will say input focus and then the pseudo element placeholder and opening curly bracket and a closing curly bracket, and I will say opacity, and I'll adjust this opacity to 0. It means it will become invisible. So if I save it and if I refresh it, notice as soon as I click into this input field, the placeholder disappears. But I want to do it over a period of time, not the sudden change, to make it look more professional, and I'll tell you another reason behind it. I will say transition duration, and I will set a very big number. 3000 milliseconds means 3 seconds, which is way too long, but just for the purpose of for learning purpose, I think it's important that you see the difference. So if I save it and if I refresh it, when I click into this input field, notice that the placeholder disappears over a period of 3 seconds, which is a bit too long, but I'll tell you the reason in a minute, and we'll change this number pretty soon. The next thing that I want to do is to move these input elements, these span elements. So these three spans vertically up. So I will have to target span elements in my CSS. I will say transform and translate Y. We want to move these vertically up, and I'll tell you the reason in a minute. And to raise things vertically up, to translate in Y direction, I will have to use a minus symbol, and I want to say 200 pixels. So if I save it now and refresh it, you will assume that this will work, but it won't. And if I refresh it, nothing happens. The reason being is that the span elements are inline elements by default, and this CSS property does not work for the inline elements. So I will have to say display block. So I have changed this span element from inline element to a block element. So if I save it and maximize this and refresh it, the span elements have moved vertically up 200 pixels, and I'll tell you the reason in a minute. So I'll change the size of my browser one more time. The next thing that I want to do is to, when I click into this input field, the name, the placeholder is disappearing over a period of 3 seconds, but at the same time I want to move this down vertically. So I'll have to use a pseudo class, and I will say label focus within. So this is a pseudo class which will not only apply to the element, which is this one, but will also apply to any of the children, in this case an input element and an span element. We want to specifically target a span element, and I want to say, I want to use this Control C and Control V, and I want to bring it back to 0 pixels wherever it was to start with. So if I save it and refresh it, notice what happens when I click into this input field. The name disappears and the span element moves down. So we want to do it slowly. So I will copy this, and again I'm using a very high number, which should not be used, but this is just for learning. So when I click into this input field, I want to bring these span elements vertically down over a period of 3 seconds or 3000 milliseconds. So if I save it and if I refresh it, notice when I click into this input field now, the placeholder disappears and the span element moves down. We also want to change the font size to 12 pixel, which is the font size of the placeholder. So if I save it now and if I refresh it, when I click into this input field, the span element comes down and the placeholder disappears, and I can type in a name and I can type in an email address. The next thing would be to hide this before it moves down. So span element again, I will say opacity to 0. What it means, when I refresh it, the span elements are still there, but they are hidden, and we want to make them reappear while they are moving down. So I will copy this, and this is the class that is responsible for the vertical movement of the span elements vertically down. So I will change the opacity back to 1 so it becomes visible over a period of 3 seconds or 3000 milliseconds. Okay, So if I save it and if I refresh it, maximize it, click into this input field, the placeholder has disappeared and the span element is now visible. I can type in anything and it will target the next span element. And I can say, and I can type in the email address and it's working fine. But notice what is happening. So when I type into it and when I click out into the next input field, this span element disappears and we don't want that. So we can also fix that. I will say comma and I will also say input colon not and within a bracket placeholder shown. I should say a colon here and then again targeting the span element only. So if I save it and if I refresh it, I click into the input field, the placeholder disappears and the span element moves down slowly, and then I type in the name and when I click out, it makes sure that the span elements remain visible. I can type in the email address and again the email the word email, the span element remains visible. And I can now type in the password and then click on register. It will refresh the page. Now notice when I'm typing in the name or clicking into any of the input fields, the vertical height of the form is changing, which is sort of frustrating. So we can always go back to our label and we can say height and we can fix it to 60 pixels. If I save it now and maximize it, refresh it, click into the input field, the span element comes down and you can type into it now, but the vertical height of the form does not change. But notice there is a bit of a gap between the span element and this horizontal line, and we want to fix that as well. And the easiest way to fix that would be to say transform in the input area, translate y, and I have experimented onto it, so 35 pixels would perfectly fix it. So if I save it and maximize it, refresh it, that's how it looks like now. So if I click into the input field now, the placeholder disappears and the name becomes visible on top of the input field. Okay, and I can say I can type in name and anything that I want to, and this is how it looks like. To make it look more interesting, I can say 35 pixels here as well. So if I save it now, refresh it, maximize it, refresh it, this span element will appear below this line. Okay, so this is another thing that you might want to do. This looks a bit better, but it's up to you, whatever you want to do. Another cool trick that I would want to show you, let me refresh it one more time and let's bring the opacity back to normal. So I've commented this out for time being. If I save it and refresh it, these are the span elements. Instead of translating the position of the span element to negative 200 pixels, I can change it to maybe 8 pixels. So if I save it and refresh it, okay, so I will, for time being, I will also disable this, and we'll probably won't need this. The font size of the span element should also be 18 pixels. So if I save it now and refresh it, we have the font size exactly the same. All we have to do is to bring it further down to maybe 10 pixels. So if I save it and refresh it, I think need to bring it further down or up. I will see what it is. Save it, refresh it a bit further down, maybe 13 pixels. So now the placeholder and the span elements are superimposing. So when I click into it, this goes down slowly and this disappears. So the placeholder disappears and the span elements comes down. So we can bring this opacity back to 0, and if I save it now, maximize it and refresh it, click onto this field, it slowly comes down. The only thing that we need to do is to change this time to maybe 300 milliseconds and this to 300 milliseconds. Saving it again, maximizing it, refreshing the page, and then when I click into it, the span elements comes down, which adds a bit of animation and makes it look a bit more interactive, a bit more professional. So I can type into this input field, these input fields. I can type in an email address and I can type in a password. Okay, so this is how it is done, and in the next lesson I will show you how to make an eye icon visible here. So when that icon is clicked, the password will become visible. So that's it for now. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next lesson.